Hello everyone, welcome to the second lecture on the unit of nanoscience and nanotechnology. In this lecture, we are going to talk about the different ways of manufacturing nanomaterials. So basically, there are two approaches or two different methodologies employed. The first one we are going to talk about is a top-down approach. So where basically we start with a bulk material and keep on chopping it off or cutting it into nano size so that until we reach the nano size. So we reduce the bulk material to get the nano size. So this is something similar to like how you make statues. So you start with a big stone and then chop it off and get a proper statue. Something similar. You start with a big bulk material and you reduce the size, keep on chopping it off, cutting it and reduce it and bring it to a nano size. What happened in this figure is that from bulk material it became a powder, and from a powder we came to a nano particle or a nano size of the same bulk material. So there are two methods which are employed. One is lithographic technique and another one is milling. I'll be covering lithography later sometime in another unit, not in here. I'm going to talk about milling. So milling or basically ball milling. So ball milling is a top-down approach, as I said, for production of nanomaterials, and it's basically used to produce metallic and ceramic nanomaterials. That's the major application. And this is like you have mills, kind of mills which are equipped with grinding media composed of wolfram carbide or steam, and the ball mills are going to rotate around a horizontal axis and they are filled with the material, the bulk material which are to be grounded along with the grinding medium. So you have something like this rotating here, the red one rotating, and say the green circles which you are seeing are the grinding media, which are either wolfram carbide or steel. The yellow ones are actually the bulk material, and when it is rotating, the bulk material comes in between this grinding media and they get crushed into smaller size. So you can see this expanded here. So these are our balls, big circles, and the materials are going through, not circles, I should better say it as sphere. So bigger balls, bigger wolfram carbide or steel balls, and in between them are the bulk materials which are going through and they are going to get crushed and into the size of nano. And this is preferably done in an inert atmosphere. A very popular, simple and inexpensive method used for producing harder materials like quartz, zirconia, alumina, etc. Next we talk about the bottom-up approach. So for that, let me go back to this figure here. So in bottom-up approach, what you're going to do is you're going to start at a smaller level. That means you start with atoms. Basically, you start with atoms. Then you consider many number of atoms, let them all join together and produce clusters of atoms. And that clusters can join again and produce a nano size particle. So what we are defining here is that bottom-up approach refers to the buildup of a material, nanomaterial, from the bottom, that is atom by atom, molecule by molecule, or cluster by cluster. Something like, on a simpler note, how we build a house. We take lots of blocks and put them all together, fill in with the cement and make a house, right? So it's something similar. And there are going to be strong bonding between the atoms which are going to help in this entire process, because you know that we are starting with something at a smaller level here, atom level, and when they are joining they obviously need to have some bonding. So there will be some bonding happening. All right. So this can happen in the production can happen in two different phases. That is either a gaseous phase or a liquid phase. So in gaseous phase, we have two methods: physical vapor deposition and chemical vapor deposition. So I'll be talking about physical vapor deposition in depth in much later in another video. And then we have a liquid phase for sol-gel synthesis and self-assembly. And if I restrict to the syllabus of the DSU students, I apologize for that for the time being, but I have to, right now, considering the COVID situation, I need to focus for the DSU students. Hopefully I come with a much advanced video on chemical vapor deposition and sol-gel synthesis later. So I'm going to now talk about self-assembly. So self-assembly, as we said, is a bottom-up approach. And self-assembly, it's very easy to understand the term. What is going to happen is that there will be a spontaneous arrangement of atoms or molecules, individual components of atoms or molecules into an ordered structure without any kind of intervention. So atoms or molecules without any interference or any intervention, any force taking place, they are going to join together and produce the structure. When we have molecular self-assembly, that means molecule joining together to produce the nanostructure, it basically involves non-covalent or weak covalent interactions. Like we have van der Waals force of interaction, that's a weak force of interaction. Next you have electrostatic force, all like that. A few examples are polymers, then we have DNA, proteins. Like if you remember your biology classes, then we know that protein is formed by successive addition of many number of amino acids. So now we come into the classification of self-assembly. We divide them into two. We divided self-assembly into two. Oops, sorry for the spelling mistake here. We divide self-assembly into two: static and dynamic. Static self-assembly and dynamic self-assembly. Now, in case of static self-assembly, the system will be in local or global equilibrium. There will be an equilibrium and there will not be any kind of dissipation of energy. There will not be any loss of energy. When I move to dynamic assembly, obviously it's out of the equilibrium, and here there is going to be some dissipation of energy or loss of energy. So self-assembly is divided into static and dynamic based on whether there is no dissipation of energy or there will be some dissipation of energy. Now both static assembly and dynamic assembly can be divided into three. That means static is divided into three and dynamic is also divided into three, and the three methods are same. First is co-assembly. So you have, say in this case, you are considering two different types of atoms, say the black ones and the red ones. So they are just going to come and join together. So what is happening in the next stage, you can see that all the red atoms are being surrounded by the blacker ones. And this keeps on continuing and you get a structure like this, where you have many number of red atoms surrounded by many number of black atoms, and one structure joined with the other and again joined with another. Like this it produces a nano structure. Next we have hierarchical self-assembly. So if you understand hierarchy, which you would have learned in history and all, this becomes easier to understand. So what we have done is we have considered many number of atoms. So in this level here you can say that the distance between the atoms are very less, and some of these atoms are going to join together. Say if I consider something like 60 number of atoms or 50 number of atoms, say 5 atoms join together, and the next stage becomes like this. Okay, I have just taken it as an example of 5 and 50. It may not be just like that. Then what happened at this level is that the distance between the atoms have now increased. This cluster of atoms is now distance is more. Now again a few clusters are going to join together and produce the next structure. And further in this stage, the distance between these clusters are going to be much more, but again they are going to join together and produce a final nano structure. So why did I talk about the distance? I can call the first one as a short range interaction because the distance between the atom is shorter. Different atoms it is shorter, distance is shorter. So it's a short range interaction. Now this is a medium range interaction. That means the distance between the clusters is of a medium level. It is more than what was there in the first stage. Next, the last one, you can see the distance between the clusters were more. So I'll call it as long range interaction. So this is about the hierarchical self-assembly. Next, the last one is a directed self-assembly. So what you have is many number of atoms, and then you consider a mask, a pattern here which has some mask. This is a kind of mask. All these oval shapes are masked, and these atoms are going to settle down on these patterns, mask patterns. So it becomes like this. This is the last stage. Actually, in some sense, you can say that if these atoms have to come and settle down here on these mass patterns, it cannot happen on its own. There has to be some external force acting on it. Okay, now I'm going to talk a bit about quantum structures. So we had talked in the previous lecture on nano that we classify materials into different types, either bulk or you have a film or a wire or a dot, right? So we are going to consider the same, something similar, and we now understand how quantization takes place when you reduce the size of the material. So we start with a three-dimensional structure, which is a bulk material. So in three-dimensional structure, there is not going to be any quantization of particle motion. So energy levels are continuous, the particle is very free to move. When I come to two-dimensional structure or quantum well or thin film, what is happening? You are reducing the bulk material in one direction. Okay, in one direction it is being reduced, resultant is a 2D structure. So the direction in which wherever you have reduced, the motion of the particle becomes quantized or movement is confined. You can say that the particle movement is confined. Only in the other two dimensions the particle is free to move. I reduce further in another direction, so that means the bulk material has been now reduced to two directions and only one dimension or one direction it is not reduced. So I'll get a one-dimensional structure or a quantum wire or a nano wire. And what happens here? So since we have reduced in two directions or two dimensions, I can say that quantization or confinement of the particle, the movement of the particle will be restricted in two dimensions or two directions, and it is free to move only in the leftover one direction or one dimension. The last we have a zero-dimensional structure, which is also called as quantum dot. What basically happens, you have reduced now the bulk material in all the three directions, all the three dimensions. So when you reduce in all the three dimensions, quantization or confinement of particle will take place in all the three dimensions. The particle is not at all free to move in any of the three dimensions. So you will get it as a quantum dot. Alright, so this is to understand a bit about density of states. So what do we understand as density of states? So we have this concept of different energy levels, and energy state is something like, I can say, like an position available for an electron to take. Okay, anywhere when you have an energy level, where do the electrons will go and sit? Let that position be called as an energy state. So how many energy states are available throughout a particular band? Say if I have like a conducting material, something like a valence band or a conduction band. How many energy states are available? That's known as density of states. Now, what is going to happen, why we have come to this is, when we reduce the size in different dimensions, we get and we go towards a smaller structure like a quantum dot. Initially, you would have had the bands or energy levels very continuous, but as you reduce the size, the energy levels become much more discrete, or quantization comes into picture. So energy levels become much more discrete, and depending on how much the size has been reduced. So say when I have like something like a gold ring which was emitting yellow color. Now emission obviously takes place when there is a transition from a high energy level to low energy level. So when you reduce the size of the gold ring or gold chain, golden material, energy levels are becoming more discrete and the gap between them are also changing. So what happens is the energy required for the transition will also change. So if energy changes, obviously wavelength of whatever photon is produced also changes. That is why the color changes when you reduce the size of the material. Now, how do we understand the different quantum structure based on this concept of density of states? So, if I have a three-dimensional bulk material, this is the relation for or expression for density of states. Say within a particular energy interval dE, have density of say Z of E dE is given as 4 pi by HU, where H is Planck's constant. 2 m star raised to 3 by 2. M star is actually effective mass of the particle under consideration. Square root of the energy into the interval length d. So the relation between Z of E and square root of and energy is actually, it's like something like a square root. So if I take a plot of the density of states and energy, I will get a parabolic shape for a three-dimensional material. If I reduce the size and bring it to a two-dimensional quantum well or a thin film, I'm going to get the distribution as a step function. It will be a step function. If I reduce it further and get a one-dimensional quantum wire, it will be something like this. So it's like at each energy levels, the density of states reaches a maximum, drops down, again increases, drops down, again increases, and then drops down. As energy increases, density of state basically increases, but it also drops down in between. What if I reduce in all the three dimensions? Density of state becomes fully discrete. It's a discrete function. You just see like lines. Now, one thing you can notice that if I consider the locus, if I just join the edges of this step function, I will get a parabola. I will go back to a parabola. Again here, if I join the edges of these functions here, I will get a parabolic shape. Again, for the zero dimension also, if I join everything, the locus will be a parabola. Obviously, that will be because you made this entire structure from a bulk material which had a distribution of parabolic shape. Now, the last topic under consideration is how do we actually study these materials. So, a normal microscope, like a simple microscope or a compound microscope, cannot help us in this case because we are going to understand something happening at a smaller size or of the order of nanometers or a few atomic level. So, you need something which will match some form of energy which will match with the size of the material. So for that purpose you need some things which are making use of electrons. So electrons become very useful as their size is proportional to the size of the material under consideration. So we are going to consider one such type microscope, one type of electron microscope, that is a scanning tunneling microscope, or also called as scanning probe microscope. This particular microscope was invented by Dr. Gerd Binning and Dr. Henry Grohrer of the IBM lab, Zurich. Now what do we have is we have a probe here with a tip, something like your pointed pencil or a pointed pen tip. So this is your probe tip and it is kept over the sample. So this is actually made up of tungsten. The probe is made up of tungsten, so it's a tungsten tip. And this is obviously going to do scanning, so that means it can move in X direction and Y direction. Two directions are there for scanning. Next, you have a voltage applied between the sample and the probe. So it's called as a tunneling voltage. We will come to see very soon. You'll understand why you need this voltage. Can't it be just simple movement? Why you need a voltage to be applied? I have now expanded this into an atomic scale in this figure. So you have, these are actually corresponding to atoms at the tip of this probe here, and these are the atoms corresponding to the sample surface. So when we come to this level, we can see that it's not that the tip is exactly touching the sample surface. There is a gap between the tip and the sample surface. So when the tip is going to scan over the surface, basically we need information from the sample going towards the probe tip, right? So that's the purpose, and let's see how it happens. So suppose we consider the energy distribution at the sample level and also at the probe tip level. And say I consider these as the electrons at the sample level and these are electrons at the probe tip level. Okay, and the gap between the probe tip and the sample, it's going to act like a barrier. So that's called as a vacuum barrier. I'm going to consider it like this. This is like a vacuum barrier. So obviously, if you have understood your basic physics, you know that if electrons have to go from the sample to the tip, that means when scanning is happening, if the probe tip has to read the sample, then the electrons have to move from the sample towards the tip, right? So if that has to happen, then the work function of the electron should exceed the vacuum barrier. Let's try to understand this in terms of classical mechanics. So classical mechanics doesn't actually allow this to happen. Electrons are very small fellows. You know the mass of electron, 9.1 into 10 power minus 31 kilogram. They are not that energetic enough to jump such a gap. So classically it is not possible. So that's where the quantum nature, that means the dual nature of electrons, come into picture, which was told by de Broglie, right? De Broglie relation for dual nature of matter. So you have particle nature and wave nature. So we are going to consider the movement of electrons now as a particle and as a wave. Suppose these are the waves representing, or this is a wave function representing the electrons at the sample. So what is going to happen is, as a wave, the electron can cross this barrier and reach the other side, that is the tip. Okay, but this process is called as tunneling. Basically it is like the electrons are trying to tunnel through that barrier. They are pushing, trying to move through the barrier. But at the end you see that the amplitude of the wave decreases when it reaches the tip. Okay, so but obviously yes, they do reach. See, we do see the wave on the other side. That obviously means that it has reached, but the amplitude is being reduced. Okay, so this is known as tunneling. Now let's go back to that case, and what if, just think of this, that these electrons, these funny looking smileys here, these smiley lovely electrons, they are going to move from the sample, they are going to tunnel as waves and reach towards the tip. But you can see that at the tip, There are already electrons existing, right? So where do these new ones go and exist? They cannot obviously come and take the position of the previous, right? They cannot have many number. You cannot have many number in a particular energy state. Why? That is being forbidden by the Pauli's exclusion principle, right? So you need to bring the energy level of the tip downward. So how do we do that? For that we apply the tunneling voltage, which is also called as bias voltage. You apply a tunneling voltage and you come over here, the energy level of the tip drops down by how much ever energy corresponding to the bias voltage or tunneling voltage applied. So now when it has come down, you can see that an electron from the sample can cross the barrier making use of the tunneling process, that is as the quantum nature, the dual nature, and come over to the tip side, and obviously it will get an energy state to occupy. So this electron which has undergone this process, you will call it as a tunneling electron. And obviously you know that movement of electrons or flow of electrons produces current. So flow of a tunneling electron is actually going to produce a tunneling current. You will call it as tunneling current. Now this tunneling current will be a function of three important points, that is the position of the probe tip, next how much you have applied tunneling voltage or bias voltage, and then what is the density of states at the sample. Now whatever is the current being produced when the probe tip scans through the sample surface, so you have the tunneling of electrons taking place producing a tunneling current. That current variation is what is being converted into an image. So the scanning tunneling microscope has a better resolution, which is down to the order of nanometers, 0.2 nanometers. It's very good in order to understand or to study friction, roughness, any defects, or any surface reaction happening in catalyst. So any surface related properties of the sample, it's very useful to understand. And because of this reason, it's a very important tool in research related to semiconductors and microelectronics. So, but obviously it do have a few limitations, like highly sensitive to the electron density of states, how many density of states are available. This can obviously create issues when you make the final image. And what if there is some oxidation taking place? What if the sample gets oxidized? Then obviously the tunneling current also reduces. So that's all in this lecture about nanoscience and nanotechnology. Thank you all.